Hello, and welcome to the first battle for the second season of Advanced Pokemon Enterprise in the Grookey Division. My name is Demon Battler, and I am the coach for the Miami Overheat. So for our first week, we are facing off against OmnicFenrir of the Nordic Wolves. Looking here, this is their roster, and looking at the roster, it's actually fairly solid. Mega Aggron is a behemoth in a physical defensive department. Latias is a strong special attacker and special defender. Sylveon is very good as a bulky cleric, as well as having a pretty strong fairy offense. Muck can be pretty tricky on its own accord, as well as having good access to poison moves and the like. Suicune is very powerful as an attacker and very strong as a defender. Crocoon is one of the most well-known sets in Smogon history. Zapdos is fairly solid both as an attacker and a defender too, and it has a great typing to help out with that. Breloom is a pretty solid attacker on its own, as well as the fact that he has access to Spore. Mamoswine is a really strong physical attacker also, adding the fact that it also has Ice-type attacks to work with is pretty good too. Spiritomb is pretty solid in general just because of the fact that it only has one major weakness, and on top of that, it also has a lot of utility in terms of setting statuses. And finally, we have Volcarona, who is pretty decent on his own accord, but once you get him set up with a Quiver Dance or two, he can be a wreck. So, looking at the roster, these are the 6 that I'm expecting to have pop up. The reason I'm expecting these is because most of these are the solid ones that you would look at and think, these are going to be a hyper-offensive team. And the goal for planning my team is going to be picking teams and setting up sets that will primarily handle these 6, while at the same time also handling possible options for the other 4. And as such, these are the Pokemon that we have brought to today's match. We have Truffles the Chinchino, who is carrying a Focus Sash, and yeah, it has Q-Charm, but that's only because the rest of its moveset really doesn't need Skill Link or Technician. And the goal with Chinchino is going to be to hopefully Thunder Wave a few of his Pokemon, make sure that everything is set to go, and hopefully help with the speed tiers, if anything. Then we have Juan the Kingdra, who is basically here to act as our Scope Lens wielding Nightmare. Basically, if we could get a Focus Energy off while he's holding Scope Lens, every attack he launches will be a crit. So if we could get him set up, he could be a very good late game sweeper. We have Roshi the Medicham, who is going to be here basically to help get some priority going, as well as having some pretty solid attacks in general. We have Gracie the Shaman, who is more or less here as a setup sweeper, I guess you can argue, but it does have a bit of defensive nature to it, and with Leech Seed it can also help deal with a couple things like sashes, or just getting a little bit of chip damage off. Then we have Xeno the Zeraora, who's rocking our Expert Belt, one of my favorite personal items. With Volt Switch, Aura Sphere, Fake Out, and Knockoff, it is a bit more of a physical attacker in that regard, which is kind of odd given its movesets. However, Aura Sphere is there primarily to deal with Mega Aggron more than anything. If Mega Aggron is there, having a strong physical attack like Close Combat isn't going to be as helpful as going for Aura Sphere, which is still going to be a pretty strong attack in general, and it'll hit the lower weaker defense of Mega Aggron. And finally, we have Hita, the Delphox. Interestingly enough, Hita does not actually have an item. The reason for this is because of her Magician ability. If we can get a hit off with her, we can steal a potential item from the opponent and make that a problem for them. So if we could snatch something like a Scarf, that can make Hita a huge threat. So guys, with that being said, let's get into the battle. Okay, so here we are for our battle. This is on replay right now because we didn't actually record during the battle itself. However, we will keep that in mind, and future weeks, I believe, might be live commentary. We'll see how that works out. Looking at Fenrir's team, it looks like we actually had most of the picks on point. The only one we had wrong was Sylveon, because we were expecting Mega Aggron, but that's not too bad. So, I was expecting Zapdos to be the opening lead, and I started with Zeraora, figuring that we could use that to stop Volt Absorb. And first turn, they actually switch into Mamoswine, expecting a Volt Switch, which allows us to actually get a quick knockoff going, and knocked off the Life Orb on Mamoswine, which doesn't necessarily kill its effectiveness, but it does help a lot in that regard. But I also knew that we were going to be seeing a likely Earthquake here, so I decided that we wanted to switch out into Shaman, and we took that Earthquake pretty nicely, got a little bit of recovery, and then we decided to switch into Kingdra, thinking that we were thinking that there was going to be an Icicle Crash happening, but instead he decided to go for Stealth Rock. So, not the best of situations, but that's okay. I was expecting him to switch out anyway, so I was kind of hoping to get I believe I went for a Scald. Yeah, I went for a Scald, and I was hoping to kind of catch a burn on something, figuring that as long as Volcarona didn't get switched out, which Fenrir was not going to switch Volcarona onto a expected Scald. I figured I could get a burn on something, and unfortunately I did not. So, I had to switch into Truffle the Cinccino, and during that point, Sylveon used Wish, and wound up getting, Sylveon got Wish off, and then we managed to paralyze Sylveon as it goes for Hyper Beam, which we were not expecting at all. And in fact, Fenrir admitted that it was supposed to be a Hyper Voice, they just kind of messed up there. But honestly, if this Hyper Beam had connected, that would have been really bad for us. But the wish came true, so Sylveon's back to full power, and we do manage to U-turn to get out of there. And we went into Delphox because we expected a potential repeat of Hyper Beam or something along those lines. So I expected that Delphox can take a hit from a Fairy attack, and it didn't wind up mattering because Sylveon actually got paralyzed, so that kind of worked out. And then Fenrir switched into Suicune expecting a fire attack, and we went for a Calm Mind, which was actually a really bad play in hindsight, because now we are faster, but we're not going to be able to do anything to deal enough damage to it, and it could kill us in return with a Scald. So we had to switch back out into Shaman, and we took the rocks, we took the Scald, and we caught a burn in the process. So unfortunately for us, that does kind of go badly. However, we did manage to switch. He switched into Zapdos, and we managed to get a Leech Seed off on him. So we got a bit of recovery that way. And then we actually switched out into Zeraora, expecting some kind of electric attack, maybe a Volt Switch, and we also managed to clear the burn. However, Zapdos actually went for a Heat Wave, and thank God that missed, because that would have been really bad as well. Like, we really lucked out in quite a few of these hits. And then we gained some life back, so the rocks didn't matter in that sense. Mamoswine comes out, but we fake out. And then, since we know we outspeed, we actually got to launch an Aura Sphere to take Mamoswine out already. And then the Latios comes in. Now, I figure Latios coming in meant one of two things. It meant either one, it was going to be Scarfed, or two, Fenrir just wanted it to be there as a general defense. I was expecting it to be Scarfed, so I decided to get out of there and go into Delphox, figuring we can at least take a hit and figure out what we're going to do. And unfortunately for us, Hita took enough damage that a second Psychic took her out. So that didn't work out for us in that sense. So we brought Truffles out, and Truffles actually was here specifically for one goal, to scout out the Scarf. Because if Latios went for another Psychic and outsped us, that would mean that we knew for a fact that Latios was Scarfed. However, Fenrir actually switches Suicune in, so we actually don't know if Latios is Scarfed at this point, but we have a pretty good idea of that. Unfortunately, Suicune is something that we can't really make too much use of to deal with, but we get a free knockoff going, clear off the leftovers, so that kind of helps out a lot too. And then we U-turn out, we actually get a crit on that hit, and switch back into Shaman. We take a little rocks damage, and then Suicune actually goes for the substitute. Now, we actually managed to use Seed Flare to clear out the sub as they go for Calm Mind, which is actually a bit of a scary thought. That being said, we don't know how much Seed Flare would do, but they actually switch out of Suicune into Volcarona as we go for another Seed Flare, and it doesn't do much. It does get the -2 special defense, Unfortunately, however, Volcarona is faster and gets a Quiver Dance off, which means that our coming Earth Power actually didn't do nearly as much damage as we would have liked. And unfortunately, that means that now Bug Buzz gets to take us out. So then we switch into Roshi, and basically I expect that Roshi is here to die. So what we want to do is we just Mega Evolve, we go into Fake Out. It actually brings it down to 11%, which is actually really good. But then we get the burn from Flame Body, which is really bad. And unfortunately, that means that our incoming Bullet Punch was weak enough to just let Volcarona live, and basically we died. So Zeraora has to come back in. Xeno manages to Fake Out and clear it out. Thankfully, Xeno does not get the Flame Body trigger as well. However, we have Latios come in, which we are expecting at this point to be Scarfed. And as it turns out, yep, Latios is in fact Scarfed. So we get to knock off, we survive his Psychic, we get the knockoff off, deals over 90% of damage, and knocks off the Scarf, so we're actually in the clear to take it out next turn with a Volt Switch. It does give initiative to Fenrir, but we figured Truffles can handle it. Sylveon comes in. Truffles actually does a lot of damage with Return, which actually did a lot more than I expected, to be honest. And then Sylveon goes for the Hyper Beam, which, unfortunately for Fenrir, actually works out well to our favor, because it was a very powerful attack, but it leaves them forced to recharge, which actually gives us a chance for Juan to come in and get off a Focus Energy. And since we're holding the Scope Lens, that means that we're actually able to guarantee a crit with Scald to take out Sylveon, and we outspeed Zapdos at this point. So we take it out with a crit Ice Beam, and then finally Suicune comes in. Suicune protects to see what we have to deal with it, and unfortunately it's not going to survive a crit Dragon Pulse here. So in the end, we actually end up with a 2-0 victory, which definitely was a lot better than I was expecting it to be. I really expected us to get swept at some point between the Latios or the Volcarona, or even Suicune if it could set up in time. So overall, we had a really good match though. And hands down, if that Heat Wave would have connected, or it was Hyper Voice instead of Hyper Beam, like Fenrir intended, we probably would have lost. So going into our MVP of the match, we actually have our MVP being Xeno the Zeraora, who not only got 3 kills off in the match, but also managed to dodge that Heat Wave, which really made a difference, because had that Heat Wave connected, it either A, would have killed Xeno, or B, left Xeno damaged enough to where that Psychic from Latios later on would have been enough to kill. And it also managed to take out the Volcarona with Fake Out just in time to avoid getting swept, since Roshi wasn't able to finish the job, which was also important. And finally, Xeno managed to survive that Psychic, knock off the Scarf, and allowed us to take it out with the Volt Switch, and then also allow Juan to sweep in the end game. So, really lucky for us in that sense. But next week, we are facing off against the Dundee Comet Punch, against Goblin, who also won last week, and this week, and they actually won with a +3 differential to our +2. So, they actually won a little bit better than we did. So we'll have to see what happens there, but we'll see you guys next week. Have a great night, everyone.